Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. This is the Iwa Katana from Fei Long Swords. And before I get into the review, a couple quick disclaimers and caveats. One, this is a review sample. It was sent to me for free to do this review. If you think that makes me biased, then you know at the start. The other bit you should know is I do study Japanese-style swordsmanship. I've been at it for a while. I've been talking about swords on the internet for a while, but I still don't fancy myself an authority figure in the subject, so keep my musings and ramblings with that context in mind. Do know as well that this is a $500-ish sword. I believe it's around that point anyway, and I'm not sure about the shipping side of things. And so that's the frame of reference I'm going to keep in my head as I think if works are good or bad, fall short or go above. I'm keeping that price in mind because you would have different expectations for a $500 sword versus a $5,000 sword or a $50 sword, right? So anyway, on with the reviewing. And as I do, I'm going to start with the Kashra, the end cap, the pommel bit right here. There's a few different things I'm looking for in this. How nice are the fittings in terms of how well cast are they? How clean are the lines? How much do they waver around? Casting molds sometimes can get used a lot. They can diminish. Things that should look crisp start to look kind of muddy or obscured or opaque in the details that are supposed to be there. So I'm looking for clarity there. And this looks very nice. It's a kind of traditional Higo design. There's a little kind of S shape marked in the top of the sword, and the lines overall look relatively clean. I don't make out a ton of imperfections from casting, and the things that look crisp, generally speaking, look pretty crisp. And I would say on a $500 sword, this is a positive. Oftentimes I see just the same old parts bin stuff used. This looks a little better. It looks like a nicer Tsuba or a nicer Higo fittings, and one that I don't see used all the time, which is appreciated. Now, the next thing I look at, apart from the fitting, which again I would say is quite nice, is how well do they transition, right? So that means, is this area, this knot here, bunchy? And so sometimes you'll see overlap. You'll see it short, and you'll be able to make out the seam between. The Ito should run right up to the end of this Fuchi, or this Kashra area right here, and it should kind of be a seamless, ledge-free transition. Likewise, the knots should not stand out really much beyond this, these kind of knots here. These shouldn't stand much prouder than those. Ideally, not at all. And in this case, they look also pretty smooth. So a lot of little details here are being adhered to. There's the most minor ledge here, but I'm being very pedantic. This is an excellently wrapped handle. Overall, this transitions well. Everything is so far getting gold stars, especially in comparison to what I see typically in the $500 price point. As we move down to the rest of the handle here, the scow, the grip area, the hilt, the rest of the hilt, general shape-wise, it has a little bit of a kind of hourglass shape. It tapers down and then swells out a little bit towards the Kashra. It's elliptical, and the knots don't stand out particularly proud, nor do the Menuki. Sometimes Menuki are bulbous and they pop out, and you see a kind of a bulbous area here, and that can aid or deter in your grip. In this case, it's pretty smooth. They don't stand very proud. The diamonds all look relatively even to my eye. They don't bounce around or wander too much. Again, for a sword in this price point, this is pretty rare. There are swirly mitsudomes put on here, which I have been told was not to bribe me, and these were here beforehand. But I happen to be very partial to this symbol contained in the Menuki area here, and so swirly mitsudomes are always a win for me. The way they lay in, though, is good. I can't really move them around that much. And the knots on here are very, very tight. This is very consistently laid out, very good, very tight. This is among the best that I've seen from forges in China at this point. So Shadow Dancer with some of the Ishigami Pro has gotten close to this, but I want to say this is even better than the stuff I've seen with Shadow Dancer, which tends to be a cut above. But this is absolutely excellent. It's maybe the best wrapped handle that I've seen in kind of a $500 sword price point. And why is that a concern? I should mention that. So if this is a little loose, then that's pretty common on Japanese swords. You can lacquer it to kind of lock it down, but if you leave it loose, then there's the possibility that it's going to loosen up and parts are going to start falling off, and it'll be very expensive to fix. It's hard to find somebody to wrap these things for under a couple $100s in the US, if you can find anyone to do the work at all. And also likely it won't look quite as nice as it did coming from the factory. So tight Ito is good, and the cost to repair it is bad. But in using it, it also sucks, because if you have Ito that is moving around, you can feel it squirm in your hand, and the kind of instinct is to white knuckle it, to bear down on the sword, to hold it really, really tight, which can diminish your ability to execute on some techniques and will also fatigue you very quickly. So having something that's tight, that feels solid, lets you, kind of instinctually handle it a little lighter, and it feels like you're connected to the weapon without having to bear down so much. So anyway, that's all to say, excellent job. This feels very tight. It's shaped really well, and I like it. All right, I'm going to move down to the Fuchi area here, this other collar area. And again, it matches the kasha, the end cap. I can make out one little casting flaw here, but generally speaking, it doesn't take on too much. It's a pretty simple fitting, but what it does reasonably well. And I think that's an excellent choice. If you try to put on some really elaborate fitting, then I'm expecting it to be a good interpretation of that elaborate fitting, and muddy lines don't work well there. Here, the deficit, there's only one line, but it's straight and relatively consistently shaped, and I would rather have that. So I think the fittings, while simple, do a pretty solid job, and they are affixed in ways that is really, really excellent. This might be one of the best. I think this gets points for maybe the best handle I've seen on a $500 sword, which was previously held by, I think, some folks at Shadow Dancer. This is really, really excellent work. Yeah, very nice. Okay. Anyway, I'm going to move on to the Tsuba area here, the crossguard. And this is a kind of Musashi 5-ring Tsuba, and it's just done a little differently. There's a lot of different interpretations of this, and it's always a joy to see another one. This is like recessed and like hollow ground or pounded out. But the Tsuba, well, it's a shape that you maybe have seen 100 different times in 100 different ways. This way is just a little different. It acts like the rim is raised on the outside, and while it's a familiar shape, it's done, again, just a little differently, which I appreciate because I see the Tsuba on the same swords all the time. So seeing one that I just don't see all the time, even if it's familiar, but like something that makes it their own, it's appreciated. So again, I like that. If I move down to the scabbard, there are horn fittings in terms of the Koiguchi area up here. It looks like a horn kurigata, this little nub that pokes out that holds the Sageo, the cord, which came as silk and feels of a decent quality. The lacquer work is nice. I don't notice any profile taper, which is beginning to be a nicety that is offered on some swords of this price point. I don't see it really taper much, if at all. And it looks like there's horn at the end here, but they are using horn pieces, which is becoming uncommon in the $500 price point, but those are still on here. And also well done. This is a really, really clean Koiguchi area. It's not filled with resin and schmutz and some of the kind of duct tape, if you will, that gets put on some other swords. This is also very quiet. It's not raspy. It doesn't wiggle around it. Like, this is a really well-fit saya. So saya doesn't necessarily look much different than other swords in this price point, but what is here is reasonably well done and using what appears to be nicer materials than other swords might be in the $500 price point. I'm going to move up to the habaki right here, this blade collar. It's not the same brass habaki that I see on everything, which is appreciated, but it's a pretty simple copper habaki, and I think there's an opportunity to maybe put some level of zazzification here, even like a line or just something to separate it from the kind of everyday run-of-the-mill shape of habaki. It does have a slightly downturned side on one, which makes it a marginally different shape, but a little bit more embellishment here would be appreciated. It doesn't have to be a lot, just something that makes it a little bit more identifiable as Fei Long. Moving from there, though, if I talk about the blade itself. So this is a Shobuzakuri style blade. The Shobuzakuri means that it doesn't have a Kasaki the same way. That the tip is a little different. The spine runs up a little further, and they're called sometimes iris leaf tips, but this looks a little, it's what is commonly considered Shobuzakuri, but what I prefer on a Shobu blade is if this enforced spine section runs all the way out to the very, very tip of the sword. I've seen antiques like that, and I like that tip reinforcement. It seems harder to do than this variety, so when I see a Shobu blade, I want that reinforced spine to run all the way out to the tip. This one is close. It at least looks different, though. Oftentimes when I see Shobuzakuri blades, it looks like they were trying to make a Shinogi Zakuri blade, but screwed up somewhere and then ground in a Shobu tip. This looks like at least was intended to be a Shobuzakuri blade. The hamon doesn't like run off in an erratic spot. It looks like it was intended to be this design, and so it's appreciated that it is. It doesn't have all the configurations of a Shobuzakuri tip that I like, but it it at least looks like the blade was intentionally made to be this rather than ground down from something else and made to fit. Shape-wise, it's not too bad. It has very, very clean grind lines. It has a pleasant looking hamon with a polish that accentuates some metallurgical effects, but it doesn't make you pay a whole lot for it. It's not a particularly elaborate polish, but detailed where it needs to be, and it stands out in just about any light. But in sunlight, it really kind of gives you a lot to look at. It's clean polish and works well for cutting, and by that I mean there's no scratchy surfaces or anything that make the blade move through things slower. Speaking of moving it around, I did EI with it. It's an excellent tool for EI. Sometimes Shobu blades don't feel good. You kind of draw the sword over the palm of your hand, and this tip has a tendency to be a little bit more pokey at times. So I get a few more scratches when I use Shobu blades, or sometimes I do. Wasn't a problem with this one. I could draw it and then, sheathe the blade the way that I have been taught to do it. It was comfortable. The sire was really quiet, and the retention in the scabbard, as well as a training tool, it was excellent. And this tight Ito is just it's just very fun to hold. It's really consistent and good. It feels like a very nice training tool. At the same time, as a training tool, doesn't have a bohie, doesn't have a reinforced kind of tip area, so I don't find it to be particularly loud. If you're going to get one for training, then having a bohie or something to make the whistle tip go a little bit louder, it would help you in training to figure out if your angles are good or are not. In terms of cutting with it, so I've used this quite a bit. I did normal things in terms of cutting pool noodles, water bottles, lighter targets, and it did all of those reasonably well. And I wouldn't say it really stood out as special. Cutting any of these targets, it's a sharp katana, and it's got a sharp edge for 500 bucks. That's kind of an expectation. It has that. It popped the noodles apart. It held up and didn't ding on water bottles, but the good and the bad are really more the sword doing the good and me doing the bad. So it covers up some mistakes, but not necessarily a lot. And it wasn't until I did more aggressive, robust things. So when I was chopping the logs and things like that, the blade really penetrates pretty well, and the edge held up quite well as well. So I cut into branches and logs, and I used it a bit more like an axe than I should, and it all held up exceptionally well. I cut through some cans as well, and there's no indication on the edge of the sword that I ever cut into any kind of metallic object. There's no deflection. There's no spot on it where I can even feel like that happened. So whatever they're doing to heat treat it, the edge is reasonably hard and seems to hold up well. And it also didn't crack particularly easily in the wood or anything, so it's not too brittle. Now, when I took the sword and slapped it on the side of my stand, I could get pretty easily a bend in the sword. So it is differentially hardened. They take bends if you slap them on the stand like that. That's why I do it. And this sword did take a bend. It didn't bend back super easy, and I can't say that it's been very wobbly during usage, but in one bad mat cut, I got it to take another little more of a bend. But once you bend them, they start bending easier, and it was in the same spot as where I hit it on the stand. So not an easy sword to bend, but also one that can, and that's something you should be aware of. The next bits that I did, though, were, cutting tatami, and this is where it kind of stood out as surprisingly good. The first mat that I took it to, it sailed through the mats. It was giving exceptionally clean cuts. It moved through it really, really quite well. And I was cutting with other really high-end swords on the day. I was using some Evolution blades and some higher-end blades that are in the thousands of dollars. And while those cut easier, this was really no slouch. And if I was at all correct in my technique, it moved through. And even if I wasn't, and I kind of scalloped cuts, it really actually did a pretty solid job for me all the time. I also did some other fun targets and cut into some thises and that's. The sword held up well. There was no edge damage that I detected throughout the course of using it. Now, normally this would be where I would depart from normal and go into the abusive side of things, but I'm not going to do that in this video. This isn't going to be a destructive test. I'm just testing this for the normal, and the debatably still falls into normal category of things. And in doing that, it's held up well. I struck the neck of bottles. It didn't deform the edge. I cut into cans. It didn't deform the edge. Probably shouldn't do that. I cut the tatami, and it did exceptionally well. What I would do here would be cut into logs and more abusive things. That's not what this is sold to do. It's not sold as a particularly high-end, super durable sword, and I don't think the folks there really want me to break it. But I have pushed it into what the normal side of things is, and it's held up and done those things really quite well. Everything is still reasonably tight. I've got just a little bit of wiggle in the Tsuba. The Ito is still tight. The edge is still sharp. It's still ready to go, ready to move on to the next class or to chop some more mats in the backyard. All right, sword friends, that's all the useful information I can give you. That's close-ups of the bits and bobs, fits and features, talking about using it for EI, talking about cutting normal things and abnormal things with it. Hopefully you got enough information to decide if it's worth your $500 or not. For me personally, do I think it's worth it? Yes. This sword, to me, is lacking a little bit in some substantial features. It could have more elaborate sword steel. It could have a better polish. It could have more bedazzled fittings. But while it might be weak in that area for a $500 sword, it's very rich in attention to detail. And that's something that is just not often an option even to pay for. Ito, this tight, a handle, this well-shaped and good feeling. Sword this sharp, that is fit this well and has as much little attention to some of the small nuances. I really appreciate it. And while the features are a little bit more akin to like a $300 sword, the attention to detail is more akin to a sword, you know, double or triple this sword's price. And so yes, that's what makes it special, the attention to some of the little details, and I really, really enjoyed handling it. So special thanks to the folks at Fei Long for sending it my way. Hopefully you found the video interesting. Cheers, and thanks for watching.